that really stood to us in good stead. But also delighted that this is also organised by our NTutor project team in ATU and our Teaching and Learning Centre. So really interesting, the NTutor project. If I'm not sure, I hope everybody is aware of it by now, but NTutor is a project that's being funded through European funding. It's being delivered really under the banner of the Higher Education Authority, and it's part of Ireland's National Recovery and Resilience Plan. And we've a very short time to deliver on what are fairly significant targets and metrics, but I have never seen a group that coalesced so quickly and that got things up and running and who are already delivering on those metrics over such a short period of time. Those of you who are familiar with the NTutor project will know that there are a number of themes, but the main themes are around digital transformation in teaching and learning, working with our students and considering the students as our partners in that teaching and learning journey, embracing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think today you're going to have the opportunity to hear a number of speakers. Certainly one of our keynotes later today, Professor Gilly Salmon, will talk a little bit about sustainability, perhaps through a slightly different lens. Sustainability means many things to each of us. Climate change, biodiversity, carbon footprint, but sustainable communities and sustainable practices will also be really relevant. And underlying all of that is the spirit of equality and inclusivity, education for all in an equal and equitable manner. And I think today's session also features academic integrity and artificial intelligence, and these are two threats, I suppose, or the next big opportunities that are coming down the line for us. You also have Neil Mosley, who is also going to be speaking today, and again, an education consultant designer well known in the higher education sector, specializing in digital, online and distance learning. But I guess what really struck me when I looked through the program, there are 19 sessions and showcases from every technological university. There are 5 now in the country, so there's participation from all 5, as well as 2 institutes of technology in Dundalk and the Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Dún Laoghaire. And I really just want to say well done and thank you all for coming together. This day is going to be a really special day, even from an ATU perspective. I'm delighted to see involvement from colleagues from right across the university, and there's a whole load of really interesting themes. So have a great day. I'm sorry, again, I'm not with you. I'm going to be joining a panel at the moment or shortly, just to talk about the future of higher education. And I think some of what you are talking about today certainly will fuel the panel that I will be participating shortly. So I might leave it at that, and thank you and wish you well for the day. Gur míle maith agus tásúlagam go minic sibh sultas an lá. Slán.
Thanks very much, Orla. Thank you. And delighted to introduce our first speaker to the conference. And before we get started, just to remind everybody, we are live all day on the conference platform. You can share ideas or memories from the day or any questions on the platform live. There is a Padlet board that has been set up on the platform. Also, you'll see details on the keynote presentations. All the speakers from today's event, everything is live on the platform. So if you have any questions, please do be active. I know many of you are online, and we have a number of moderators that will be feeding back any key questions that are coming through. So, so that covers that. So next we're going to move on to Neil Mosley. So thank you so much, Neil, for being with us today. I'm delighted to introduce Neil. He's an education consultant and designer. He's well known in the area of digital transformation, online and distance learning. He's worked in previous roles in Imperial College and Cardiff University, where he helped shape and develop their digital and online education strategies. And he certainly supports a lot of organisations, both higher education institutes and many private companies and multinationals, in working on their digital, online and distance learning development and different types of digital technology projects. So delighted to have you with us, Neil. And I'll hand over to Neil for our first keynote this morning. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just bear with me a moment while I just get my slides up. That's great, fantastic. Fantastic, that's great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invite. Thank you for all of you who've come today and all of you who are online. This is my very first trip to Ireland, so it's really exciting for me to be here, and I hope it's the kind of first of many across the Irish Sea from kind of Cardiff in Wales, where me and my family are based. Now, I guess at the heart of what I want to talk about today is a bit of perspective on what I think are important things for us to keep a hold of as we, I guess, grapple with change that's primarily driven by digital technology and kind of what's happening in that space. But I guess before I kind of get into that, it's probably worth saying that this idea that digital technologies are kind of disrupting universities and education, or this kind of anticipatory sense that digital technologies are going to bring about a big change in education isn't anything all that new. And just to kind of demonstrate that, I came across a paper from 1995. It was written by an American academic called William Wolfe, and it's got a catchy title. It says, "Warning, information technology will transform the university." And in it, he said this, he said, "Outside forces are always acting on universities. Some of them, notably the political ones, have great immediacy and hence get a good deal of attention. I believe that information technology has a far greater potential to provoke fundamental change in our system of higher education. Moreover, I am certain that these changes are much closer than people realize." So that was written nearly 30 years ago. And I guess in the timeline of digital change, we might think that kind of with everything that's happening with AI, we kind of reached a bit of crescendo in that timeline. But again, irrespective of what we think about that, I suppose what we can say is that change and kind of challenge as a result of developments in digital technology have been a pretty constant presence over the kind of past 30 years in education, probably further back. And these developments, they all require some kind of response. And I suppose we've seen that in the last 6 months in terms of universities and what they do about AI. Okay, yeah, no worries. And I think there's a number of things that can influence how we respond to those things. And I guess the first thing to say on this is that, you know, one of the challenges around responding is we don't always necessarily know how things are going to develop and how things are going to play out. And it was the French philosopher Jacques Ellul who said that unpredictability is one of the general features of technological progress. So that's one of the challenges, I think, around digital technologies, kind of the uncertainty of how things might play out. And I think there's another kind of influence that's wrapped up around digital change and kind of how we respond to that. And again, if I can kind of quote Jacques Ellul again from his book, The Technological Bluff, because he articulates this well. He says that we live under the threat that if we fail to embrace new technologies, we'll be pushed aside into cultural obsolescence, left without key skills to get a job, and disconnected from cultural conversations. So there's also this kind of influence around feeling you need to kind of get on board with technological developments, or conversely, the kind of fear of the consequences if you don't kind of get on board with those things. And, you know, over the years, I think we've seen kind of interesting responses to changes in digital technology. And I guess one big talked about story in terms of the corporate world is the American photographic company Kodak. So one of the reasons why that's interesting is that over the kind of 2000s, they kind of essentially declined in part due to their response to digital technological changes around kind of how we share and take photos, and they kind of filed for bankruptcy back in 2012. And I'm sure you can probably think of other examples of kind of companies in a similar era when things were really changing around digital technology. And I guess I think no one really wants their organization or their university to kind of become a bit of a byword for sort of failure to adapt and change to a kind of changing digital world. And digital-led change in universities is often framed as a real big necessity, isn't it? It's that the universities kind of don't want to become the sort of educational equivalent of Kodak. And the common framing is, unless universities kind of quickly transform, then they risk becoming kind of irrelevant and obsolete. And it would be difficult to go online to find that kind of framing around what universities need to do in response to things that are happening with digital technology. So this is kind of influence driven by fear, becoming irrelevant or obsolete. And I think there's also the influence of the kind of actual and projected changes around the world of work and universities needing to do something differently because of that. So recently, the World Economic Forum, they released a white paper that was called Defining Education 4.0, a taxonomy for the future of learning. And if I can just paraphrase a few things from there, they kind of articulate this kind of thing quite well. So they said across a wide range of research into the future of work by the World Economic Forum and other organizations, employers are signaling demand for creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, and skills related to the development and use of technology. The future of education lies in empowering learners to embrace and develop their uniquely human qualities, those unlikely to ever be replaced by technology. So I think this kind of encapsulates that kind of influence that says education needs to respond to future changes because of kind of technological developments. And I think there's one last kind of influence, and that's kind of one of perception. So I don't know about you, but it's really interesting to see the reactions to some of the responses that education institutions have kind of done in terms of the developments around AI. So that could be the group of 8 universities in Australia. So they kind of initially announced that they were going to go back to on-campus exams because of the kind of threat of AI. There's a bunch of New York schools that banned ChatGPT on their networks. There was a bunch of UK universities that were reported to have banned their students from using ChatGPT. And I guess regardless of what you think the right course of action is around those things, I don't think banning always plays that well, does it? It doesn't really look that good. It's not great PR. It kind of makes you look quite anachronistic if you kind of take that approach. I think being seen to embrace technology is a much better look for us all. And I guess in that, there's always a kind of danger that the way that we respond to developments isn't always rooted in anything all that solid. And there's a danger that we can just get carried on a particular path and trends and the zeitgeist. And we can be influenced by all of those factors that I mentioned in relation to kind of how we respond to digital technology and digital technological advancements. So with all of that in mind, what I want to talk about today is what I think are kind of important influences for university teaching and learning to kind of help us navigate digital-led change. And I guess my kind of key point or theme is that I think as a whole, we kind of need to develop some firmer roots in understanding kind of what we know about learning and what the research points to being important around learning. Because I think that can help us navigate advancements in technology. It can help us to really utilize technology in effective ways. And I think it can help us in terms of responding to the kind of needs to develop our students for a future changing world. And I guess ultimately we know that whatever kind of waves kind of roll over higher education next, kind of advancing student learning is always going to be kind of pretty critical to that. Now, so far I've kind of alluded to developments in digital technology, and that obviously gets a lot of attention for obvious reasons. But I think what's got a lot less attention are kind of advances in what we understand and what we know about learning and how we learn. And on the back of those advancements over a number of decades, people have actually gone to the extent to say that we're in this kind of golden age of learning science, which is the kind of catch-all term for the range of disciplines that look into and study kind of how we learn and how human learning works. But as Professor Barbara Oakley, so she's behind one of the most popular online courses called Learning How to Learn. As she said recently, thanks to researchers all around the world, there's been an enormous vault forward in understanding how we learn. The challenge is getting that out to teachers to help students. And I don't think it's all that unreasonable to say that, the kind of body of knowledge that's being built up around learning hasn't sort of filtered through sufficiently to kind of widely influence what we do in teaching and learning as a kind of whole. And I'm not always convinced that it's had enough of an influence on education technology and kind of how we use that sometimes too. And I wonder, if we were to kind of pose the question, has digital technology really improved learning and teaching over the last 20 plus years? What we'd say to that? It's kind of a bit of a broad general question, but has it really turned the dial? It'd be an interesting thing to explore. It was interesting recently to read an article from Bill Gates, and what he said in this article, he said, computers haven't had the effect on education that many of us in industry have hoped. They haven't had a meaningful effect on any measures of students' achievement. And I should just say, I've not picked Bill Gates because I think he's my go-to for education or he's a great educationalist. But the reason that kind of quote stuck in my mind a little bit was that he's a really strong advocate for technology kind of enhancing and changing and altering education. So it was interesting that even he kind of acknowledged that the dial hasn't been turned as much as maybe it might have been. And I guess what I'd say is that over the years, I've seen loads of great uses of digital technology. So there's nuance there, and I'm sure we're going to see lots of showcases of digital technology being used in fantastic ways through the course of today. But I've also kind of seen examples and continue to see digital technology not always being used and harnessed in ways that maybe are in harmony with some of the things that we know about learning. And so I think it's not unreasonable to say there's a bit of unfulfilled potential around our use of digital technology in learning and teaching. And for me, I guess one of the contributing factors is kind of its use being informed by some of the things that we know about learning. And in her book, Teachers versus Tech, The Case for an EdTech Revolution, Daisy Christodoulou, she's an English teacher and educationalist, she kind of put this a bit more starkly than me. And she said, I've read many different explanations of why education technology has failed and what it would take to change that. If only there was more money or better training or more open-minded teachers, then technology really could improve education. However, ultimately, I have concluded that more important than any of these factors is the power of bad ideas. If we assume that learning styles exist, that cognitive overload doesn't exist, that students can pick up knowledge as they go, and that attention is an infinite resource, we will never improve education, however much or little technology we use. If we persist with faulty ideas about how humans think and learn, we will just extend a century-long cycle of hype and disillusionment. So for Daisy, the kind of big issue is around kind of bad ideas about learning that inform our use of technology. And I guess for me, I think one of the areas where we might be a little bit susceptible to kind of bad ideas or kind of distortions around learning is around the kind of role of knowledge and memory in learning and teaching. And I think this is an area that intersects with a few of those challenges that I talked about, advancements in technology, using technology and preparing our students for a future changing world. And I think one of the reasons why we're susceptible is kind of negative baggage and associations around kind of knowledge and memory when it comes to kind of learning and teaching. And I guess maybe for some people, kind of me sort of standing up here in 2023 talking about knowledge and memory is kind of pretty old school. I mean, like literally old school, isn't it? In relation to education, they're the kind of relics of education past. They kind of conjure up associations of kind of uninspiring attempts to fill students' heads with disconnected set of facts that they then kind of test whether they can kind of recall them or not. And as Professor Michelle Miller said, so she's a professor of psychological sciences at Northern Arizona University. She said, if you want to get teachers up in arms, suggest that their life's work is all about getting students to memorize facts. The specter of the teacher as memorization cop still fills us with indignation. So talking about knowledge and memory is probably pretty unfashionable and carries with it lots of different kind of negative associations, I think, and baggage. But I think if we've been guilty of maybe overemphasizing knowledge and memory in kind of past incarnations of education, I think we sort of need to be careful to not de-emphasize that in kind of future education in terms of how we use digital technologies and what that means for those things. And I'll kind of go on to say why I think that, but I think there's sort of subtle influences around that exist around de-emphasizing that. And I think kind of manifestations and sort of mutations of things like Bloom's taxonomy, which is, used a lot in education. I think those, that can have a subtle influence. So this is the kind of chart there, and you kind of see knowledge and memory sits at the bottom there. It's a sort of less salubrious area of teaching and learning. And although the kind of taxonomy, when it was initially developed, kind of acknowledged that knowledge was a sort of precondition for those kind of higher level things, I think sometimes as that's been kind of pyramidized, if that's a word that I kind of come up with, and as that's kind of been passed around, I think by representation and interpretation, sometimes it's become a bit distorted in kind of conversations and how we interpret that. And I think we also kind of see knowledge being de-emphasized a little bit around the future of education. So I mentioned the World Economic Forum's taxonomy. I probably can't make that out all that well, but you kind of got knowledge sort of keeping out of sight down at the bottom there. And I guess the danger is that some of these things might sort of subtly de-emphasize the role that plays, and kind of acquiring a kind of strong knowledge base might play in the kind of future of learning. And I think there's kind of also other ways, more sort of modern ways, in terms of how we kind of maybe at risk of de-emphasizing a little bit of the role. And that's kind of in relation to digital technology specifically. So the idea that, the internet basically means that, we don't need to kind of develop a knowledge base ourselves. If we kind of want to draw on knowledge, then we can kind of look it up. The knowledge is sort of our kind of extended memory and our kind of knowledge base by proxy. And although this kind of line of thinking was very much sort of driven by the internet and the kind of information age and everything that's there, I'm starting to see kind of more arguments around this in relation to generative AI. So I've heard kind of statements like knowledge is dead, AI renders information useless, and knowledge-based learning is dead. We need to focus on kind of creativity and critical thinking. And lastly, in kind of relation to Bloom's, that the kind of World Wide Web and Wikipedia have dealt with the bottom layer of kind of knowing and understanding in the taxonomy. But I guess I'd like to just kind of gently challenge some of those views and the kind of inferences that we might make from things like taxonomies and the kind of influence that digital technology might have on what's important and what's not in terms of kind of the learning process. And I guess one of the kind of first points to make is that kind of having a really good knowledge base that you can really bring to bear for kind of those high level skills and those high level applications, that's kind of a hallmark of real experts in different fields. So there's been a lot of research on experts and kind of what they demonstrate and what's kind of behind their expertise. And it always seems to be that kind of knowledge and then kind of knowing stuff and bringing those things to bear is really important for that. So Michelin Chi and Robert Glaser, they're renowned scholars in the US around kind of learning. And they wrote in their book, The Nature of Expertise, that an expert has developed an organized body of knowledge that can be readily accessed and used. And a chap called Anders Ericsson, who's a pretty well-renowned researcher in kind of expertise and expert performance, him and his colleagues wrote in a paper that what distinguishes expert performers is mostly more and better organized knowledge, which had to have been acquired. So those things are an important component of expertise in a range of fields. But I guess I should sort of step back at this stage and say, the destination that we maybe want to get our students isn't kind of expert yet, is it? Often, we're kind of, there's a kind of big path and a journey to that. But I think there is a bit of an important implication here, because I guess when we think about how the world of work's predicted to change, a lot of the discourse on that is around what we need to focus on: higher order thinking, creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, all those kinds of things. And, if that's the case, and there's, good reason for that, then I think we need to sort of try to best understand, the process by which people kind of get to display those things and get kind of solid with those things, and what kind of underpins those things. And I guess one of my kind of observations sometimes around our kind of discourse of education is that we tend to sort of go from one end of the spectrum to the other. We sort of swing on a bit of a pendulum, and it can kind of lead us to sort of, a bit of binary thinking where we pit kind of knowledge acquisition against skills development, higher order and lower order. And, I think the reality is it's not necessarily about kind of finding a balance or one thing or the other. I think it's sort of determining, what we need to do, experience, develop, know, understand, practice that's going to get us to that place, really. And actually kind of knowledge and memory are going to play a part in that, and they're not competitors to those things. They're important kind of components, subcomponents of developing that. And to just pick up on a quote from Michelle Miller again, so she wrote a really good book called Remembering and Forgetting in the Age of Technology. And she's kind of just referencing the kind of relation of the value of kind of knowledge and memory, and reflecting on kind of research on that. And she says there's a surprising amount of research that shows that memory and thinking skills enjoy a complementary, not a competitive relationship within learning. And when students acquire a more solid base in an area, and when they do so using more efficient memory strategies, their thinking skills develop in specific beneficial ways. And if you can draw on one other reference, that's from the educational psychologist Daniel Willingham from the University of Virginia. And he's done a lot of work on kind of exploring, critical thinking is important, but how do we teach it? What goes behind it? And what he concluded was that critical thinking is sort of enabled by stores of knowledge about the kind of area, about the domain. And I think what we'd all agree on is the kind of particular aspirations around the kind of higher level skills and the critical thinking, creativity, all those kinds of things that are really spoken about as being more and more coveted in learning and more important to kind of instill in our students or kind of develop in our students. I think we'd all agree that that's really important and really good, and it's going to be important increasingly in the future. But I guess my point really is that we just kind of need to be careful to really consider what goes into developing those abilities in our students. And, I'm kind of keen to stress that knowledge and memory by no means the whole story. They're a kind of a component. But I think if we de-emphasize those things, and some of the narrative around digital technology, I think, runs a risk of that, then that's potentially going to be self-defeating. And I think just to pick up on another line of thought on that, I guess the risk is that it might widen inequality a little bit. And that's in part due to the kind of multiplier effect or the kind of Matthew effect, the kind of rich will get richer, of kind of what we already know and its importance for new learning and engaging with new things. The kind of educational psychologist David Ausubel, he said that prior knowledge is one of the most important determinants of students' learning success. And Ed Hirsch, who's a professor of education in the US, he said that prior knowledge is a kind of a mental Velcro. It kind of helps us make sense and helps us kind of develop new learning. So we know it kind of plays a crucial role when it comes to learning new things and kind of making sense of stuff. But it also seems like it might kind of affect a little bit the rate at which we learn. So there was some interesting research released, if I can get my words out, released recently. And it was from the Human Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And the paper was called An Astonishing Regularity in Student Learning Rate. And basically the researchers, they did a kind of wide range of research across a bunch of different students, and they kind of set out to answer the question, why do some students learn faster than others, or do they? And essentially what they found in that research is that students kind of actually learn at a very similar rate. There wasn't huge differences around the kind of rate that they learned, but what the initial levels of knowledge was a really key factor in terms of people learning at a kind of slower rate, I guess. And they concluded the paper by saying these results suggest that educational achievement gaps come from differences in learning opportunities, and that better access to such opportunities can help close those gaps. And, I guess there's a lot of common sense in that. It's not kind of necessarily a radical statement in terms of, opportunity breeds kind of further opportunity. But I guess there's just that risk, really, if we de-emphasize some of these things, and that might have the impact of kind of widening disadvantage for those that maybe haven't had the opportunities to develop prior to kind of coming into those things. And so if there's kind of that element of kind of queasiness around knowledge and memory, then I think kind of probably important to maybe reflect on that and what that means in a digital age, because I think if we kind of de-emphasize the importance of it in relation to learning, then there are potentially some kind of problematic kind of directions that we might go in around that side of things. I just want to make one kind of last point on this, which is kind of, I guess, in relation to sort of current times and current kind of discourse around AI and all that kind of thing. And this quote from German industrial designer Dieter Rams, who is kind of a big hero of mine, is kind of sort of behind that a little bit, sort of saying we have to be careful now that we rule over the digital world and not ruled by it. Because it's been interesting, I don't know about you, kind of following some of the kind of discourse and kind of discussion around AI, because I think some of the responses almost kind of seem to almost suggest that we kind of abdicate our responsibility to kind of develop our own knowledge base and our own understanding on the basis that kind of some of the ways that we might demonstrate that, can be done more effectively by technology. And I think there's almost kind of a line of thought that kind of might almost lead us to being a bit subservient sometimes to technology and not necessarily being in control of that and using it for our own advantage. And I've seen arguments like we shouldn't set assessments that computers can complete. And I think there may be certainly something in that in terms of certain areas in a case-by-case basis, but I think we need to be careful a little bit with that kind of line of reasoning in a kind of general sense. And I guess we have to ask the question, should we let what's happening in digital technology kind of alone determine the kinds of things that we get students to do on their path to a particular goal? And often kind of acquisition of knowledge can be in the firing line a little bit around those kind of things. I think we sort of need to consider that kind of humans go through different stages of learning. And through those stages, we might need to ask students to do things that computers can do much better than they can. Because they need to kind of go through that stage or kind of acquire that skill or acquire that knowledge, which is then in turn going to help them to really wield that technology or kind of surpass it or get to the level where they've kind of developed those skills that it's talked about as differentiating us from those technologies. And I guess to make one last point on this, it strikes me that kind of critical thinking and some of the things that enable that, like knowledge, that's going to be more important now than ever because, we've got the risk of kind of misinformation, making sense of just a vast amount of information that's out there. And also kind of in terms of evaluating our conversations with AI and what comes back and what kind of the accuracy and the meaning of that is. So I've talked a little bit about knowledge and memory, and that's kind of under this banner of having roots in what we know is kind of an important component of learning to kind of help us navigate some of the things that are happening driven by digital change. I want to just pivot a little bit now and talk about something different, and that's metacognition. And again, I think this intersects with the kind of three sort of main challenges that are presented around digital. So that's advancements in technology, using the technology, and kind of preparing students for a future world. And now I'm kind of assuming most people are sort of familiar at a general level with metacognition. That's kind of thinking about one's own thinking or thinking about one's own cognition. But it might be just helpful to kind of demonstrate a little bit of what I mean in relation to learning and metacognition, just through an example. And I'm going to draw on these three concepts. So metacognitive knowledge, monitoring, and control. And if I can just give a really quick example to just draw out some of these things. So imagine you're at home and you're kind of listening to music and you're just about to study something that you've kind of been learning about in your course recently. So you can start by turning the music off because you kind of realize that studying requires your attention, and attention is really important for learning. And the music is likely to distract you. So at that point, you're kind of displaying metacognitive knowledge. You're kind of displaying knowledge about how learning operates. how to improve learning, what's important around focusing attention and removing distractions. And then as you continue on, you realize that you've kind of grasped, or you feel you grasped, a large portion of the things that you're studying, but there's a particular concept, a particular area that you're struggling with. And at that point, you're kind of displaying metacognitive monitoring. You're kind of assessing how well you understand something, you grasp something. And so you decide to kind of turn your attention to that concept specifically. And you decide to adopt a different kind of strategy. So it might be something like a kind of a brain dump, where you kind of write down everything you think you know about that thing, and then you interrogate that against the kind of the textbook or whatever information you have that kind of explains that concept in detail. And that's kind of an example of metacognitive control, which is essentially you focusing on the area you're having difficulty and kind of adopting a new and a different strategy to kind of try to address that. So that gives you kind of a little bit of a flavor of metacognition kind of in learning. And I wonder, if you kind of reflect on that, I wonder how well you'd assess your own metacognitive abilities. And if you teach, how well you'd assess your students' metacognitive abilities. Because whenever I think about this, I always think back to my studies, and I think I've been pretty poor on all of these measures. And this was a long time ago now, but when I was studying, I studied at music conservatoire. I was really driven to become a jazz musician. My degree was in jazz. That's my fun fact about myself. But I devoted hours and hours to practice. And whenever I reflect on some of these things, I often wonder to what extent I was kind of chasing my tail with a lot of what I was doing around studying and the kind of time I used. And I think in higher education, not just based on my experience, I think we have kind of neglected a little bit metacognition kind of in the past. And that's certainly been my experience working in higher education and just reflecting on the kind of things that get spoken about and focused on when we're kind of designing courses or we're kind of talking about that side of things. But it is a really important component of learning. And, if I'm saying that we kind of need to develop firmer roots in some of those things to help navigate change, then I think we can't afford to neglect metacognition. And I think there's a little bit of a danger with our use and our thinking around digital technologies that with the changes and advancements that we've seen, that we could continue to kind of go on this path of maybe neglecting it a little bit. And I guess I say that for kind of two main reasons. I'm not always sure that the kind of products in this space necessarily focus that much on these kinds of things and developing students' metacognitive abilities. And the second reason is kind of related again to this idea of personalization, which gets mentioned a lot, I think, in relation to technology and digital education and kind of progress around that. And we see how AI has really personalized a lot of our experiences, not just in education, but across a range of different technologies that we use. And I guess personalization has often been framed as, the great answer to one of education's biggest problems, which is kind of how can a limited number of teachers, effectively support the kind of individual personal needs of a kind of whole range of students. And so kind of technology that can support and adapt, is really, really appealing. And, I think it kind of makes sense in lots of different ways. So one really popular example, I guess, of kind of AI-powered personalized learning is Duolingo. I'm sure people have used it. I've certainly used it. Whenever I mention Duolingo, there's two words that come into my head, which is una manzana, which gives you a kind of indication of where I'm at with Spanish language learning at the moment. But I digress a little bit. But one criticism of that, really good platforms, lots of good things about it. And I guess in platforms like it is kind of limitations. And one of those is around kind of metacognition. And I guess we could ask the question, to what extent are they also seeking to develop metacognitive abilities like monitoring and control? And to what extent do the kind of underlying principles around learning that kind of fuel those platforms, to what extent are those kind of transparent to kind of users? And I I read a paper recently called Supplementing Mobile Assisted Language Learning with Reflective Journal Writing. And it was from a professor at the University of South Florida called Matt Kessler. And he said this in relation to Duolingo and technologies that are similar to that. He said that these technologies typically do not allow for critical self-reflection or for users to consider different aspects of their learning, such as the task itself, the strategies they use, and the challenges they face. And his paper basically details how he supplemented Duolingo with these use of weekly reflected journals, and he found it had a really positive impact on students' kind of metacognitive awareness over the period of the course. And I think that's a really, really nice adaptation, actually, and kind of a really good use for us to kind of reflect on. But I think it also kind of highlights maybe some risk, which is, we have to be careful, really, I think, that the digital technologies that kind of develop and get more advanced don't kind of subsume metacognition into their sort of black box, if you like. AI's potential to personalize, I think, is great, and I'm not kind of decrying that. I think it's got some real value, but I think we just have to be careful that we don't sort of essentially outsource developing some of those abilities in us because of the power of the AI to kind of personalize those experience. And obviously one way around it is that example of kind of Matt Kessler and what he did there in terms of using the technology, which was kind of a nice thing that he did. I think another kind of wider point around metacognition is also to just reflect that to a certain extent, that's one of the things that actually distinguishes us from artificial intelligence in a way. So it would seem a bit of an odd path if we sort of maybe tacitly let technology kind of diminish in us something that kind of distinguishes us a little bit from artificial intelligence. And I came across a really interesting perspective on that. It's from a retired Brazilian professor called Ronaldo Mota. He is a visiting professor at the UCL Institute of Education, if you've heard of that. He put it in quite stark terms, actually. He said, in short, on this ultimate battleground between humans and machines, our greatest tool is education. Within it, it is necessary to explore metacognitive focuses and approaches, essential elements both in terms of differentiation and possible competitive advantage. Whether we will triumph in the end, we still don't know. But if we don't focus on metacognitive education, we'll certainly be heading for yet another defeat as a species, in this case, defeated by machines that paradoxically we created ourselves. So he kind of presents it really starkly as almost kind of an existential thing around focusing on metacognition. And it'd be interesting to know what people think about that. But I think there's kind of other reasons why it's important to focus on it. And that's around this kind of projections around the future of work. Because, I guess one of the big messages that's always coupled with projections is the importance of being a lifelong learner. And I read an article and it was written by a chap called Ravi Kumar, who's a kind of head of Infosys. They're a big kind of global IT firm. And he kind of conveyed this sort of sense well. I think he said, we'll now have to move to a continuum of lifelong learning, which essentially means we have to be lifelong learners. So I think following that kind of line of reasoning, then, developing those abilities that I've kind of talked about, metacognitive knowledge and monitoring and control, they're going to be really important for kind of equipping us and equipping our students to be lifelong learners in the futures and kind of be adaptable to changes. And so I think maybe that encapsulates a little bit of the kind of point that I'm trying to make, which is I think what we know about learning, what we know is important for learning can help us with a bit of perspective on how we navigate some of these changes that we're seeing in relation to digital technology and what that means for kind of education and how we kind of, set our path around that kind of thing. And I'm conscious kind of been speaking for a little while now. So I just kind of want to just wrap up with a little bit of summary of kind of my main argument, really. And I've sort of adapted a double diamond design process diagram to try to articulate that. And so I guess I've spoken about kind of three main changes, three main kind of developments that kind of interface with education. So preparing students for a future changing world, how we use technology, and also kind of navigating what's coming down the road in terms of that. And I guess there's a bunch of different influences that can kind of influence how we deal with that challenge and that kind of opportunity. And I guess I've talked about one particular area, and I kind of really important to stress that in that kind of diamond of key influences, there's a whole bunch of different things. But my focus really has been, how can what we know about learning help us to navigate some of those things, some of those challenges and opportunities. And I guess I've almost sort of deliberately presented kind of contrasting things. So you've got the kind of unfashionable area of knowledge and memory, and then you've got the kind of slightly more palatable area of kind of metacognition and kind of human agency and all those kind of things. And I guess I've talked about those in terms of the kind of general importance rather than kind of diving deeply into like what that means for learning and teaching, because I guess my kind of provocation is that what are the key influencing factors that help you to kind of go on and to weigh and to use your wisdom around kind of how to act in a specific way to some of those challenges and some of those opportunities that digital education affords us. Because I think that can really help us. It gives us a strong sense. It gives us a kind of a mental framework that kind of helps us to think through some of these challenges and kind of develop a kind of direction that we might go in and what that kind of might mean. So I'm going to kind of leave it there because you've been really attentive, and thank you for listening. You kind of listened to me go on for a little while now, but I kind of just want to open it up for the kind of remaining time that we have for questions, comments, reflections that people have on some of those things that I might have kind of provoked. I don't know if do we have a yes? Thank you. Thanks very much. So does anyone have any questions, comments, anything they'd like to add? And maybe Karina, you could, or someone could tell me when I need to shut up and go stage. Yeah, hi.
At Red Safety, learning start kind of relates to the idea of equity and EDI. So something that kind of comes up a lot is, yes, digital transformation can help us be more inclusive and widen access, but also recognizing that there is a digital divide and who has access to these kind of services and technologies. So is there anything to comment on that? Will you feel like going or should go?
Well, I think the first aspect of that is as all of us kind of widely acknowledging that. I think, we can get sucked into that hype, and we can get sucked into the assumption. I read pieces and it say, well, everyone uses technology now and everyone has a mobile device and actually not everyone has those kind of opportunities. And so I think in the same way we've kind of made progress in kind of other areas about understanding where our students are at. I think the first stage is actually we need to all kind of have an understanding of that and also kind of check ourselves when we're in danger of saying, look, everyone's got these things. So I think that's the first thing that we kind of need to sort of almost educate ourselves that that's not the case. I think on that, there's probably something as well around the technology and how we use the technology around managing that. So, I think we've had lots of talk around accessibility in terms of alt text, or we got captioning up today, haven't we? We kind of got those kind of things. But what about lower bandwidth ways? What about thinking about those kinds of things? I came across a part of a university website recently that was, I guess it was targeting students from Africa, and they had a low bandwidth version of their website. And it kind of made me think around, they'd obviously really thought about the digital position, if you like, of those students. And I think, we need to think about those things. And sometimes actually less is more anyway for our students. So I think the first stage is there needs to be a much more widespread acknowledgement that we're not all on really high-powered smartphones with great data plans and great places to study in our houses. I think the pandemic helped with that, certainly, and helped challenge that. But then I think we need to think about how do we implement technology? What changes will we need to make to kind of be more inclusive to all of that? And I think some of those things won't be negative for students who are in more favourable positions around digital technology, I think.
There's a question online here, Neil. I'll just read it out for you. So I found it very interesting that educational gaps come from educational opportunities. I'm aware that a lot of students are not accessing the supports and services available in universities, which would level the playing field through things like software and technology supports due to the stigma around disclosing that they might need help. So the question is, have you any idea how we can reach these students in a more effective way so that they will come forward and get the learning supports that they need?
Gosh, yeah, that's a hard question. I know when I was working at Cardiff University, I know speaking to people who were working in that kind of area, that was a real challenge around people actually kind of coming forward and acknowledging those things. And I think even a lot of the support services, I think the phrase that stuck in my head when I would speak to colleagues in that kind of arena was that they often get the kind of worried well, rather than those who have a real need. I think it's a really, really challenging one. I kind of wonder whether there is a role in terms of how digital technologies might support maybe a bit more kind of a different kind of means of interacting and sharing those things, perhaps. But I think kind of relationships are a key aspect of that, and kind of being able to get alongside students and kind of understand, the challenges that they face. And that's kind of a difficulty, I guess, if you've kind of got a large class. But I've definitely seen ways in which people have designed courses such that kind of rather than this kind of more reactive model of you come to me for help if you need help, more kind of proactive means of kind of putting in short time between academics or educators, so that you kind of have that initial conference with students and kind of build that trust and build the kind of relationship there that hopefully you'd hope that enables students to kind of feel like they have the kind of trust and confidence to do that. And you can kind of see that manifested in different ways in which people are kind of modifying office hours and providing access to themselves. But I think, there's obviously a kind of a barrier there around trust and confidence to kind of disclose things. And I think kind of relationships and feeling like you have the kind of trust of, I guess probably people that you more directly engage with in your course is kind of part of that. But that's, it's probably one of those things where it would be easy to say there's one particular solution, but there's probably a whole range of different factors around that. Anyone else? Any more takers? Yes, Brian.
Friends, I'd like to be able to. I was very interested in your comments about prior knowledge, and I was wondering, would an implication of that be that we should be moving more towards mastery-based learning, the idea of everybody in cohorts in classrooms, and some people coming through with 80-90%, and some people just barely squeezing through and going on to an ongoing class is a serious problem with how we teach at the moment. And that mastery-based learning, where you can't move on until you've reached a certain level of competency or knowledge, could help solve that. But the trouble is that you can't do mastery-based learning without technology. And not only that, you almost need to redesign. So the question is, do you agree that mastery-based learning could address that problem? And what would you see as the challenges of implementing mastery-based learning in an institution?
Thanks, Brian. I guess a couple of things to say on that. I mean, you've got Western governors in the US who are kind of well known for their competency-based model, which I suppose is kind of an aspect of that. And there are universities in the UK who are thinking more about that side of things. I think that definitely helps. And there's been instances, you referenced technology, and maybe it's not necessarily under the banner of mastery-based learning, but I know Arizona State University did do some really good things about remediating students in particular areas through things like adaptive software to kind of bring them up to speed in areas, and that was really, really helpful. I guess this is, a lot of the talk, I suppose, in higher education, certainly kind of that I've seen, is the kind of future is blended and hybrid. And I think there's a really good researcher in the US called Charles Graham. He's done a lot of research on blended learning. And what he often does, he talks about the kind of affordances of blended learning as the 6 Ps. And one of the Ps is pacing, that blended learning offers the opportunity for you to kind of manage pacing based on students being at different levels. And he also kind of mentioned one of the Ps, personalization as well. So I think absolutely. I guess a lot of what I've said today is around a kind of a challenge to say what's important. And I kind of referenced how metacognition maybe isn't, I don't sort of hear it talked about as much when we're thinking about design. And I could probably maybe say some similar things about prior knowledge. So if we're not sort of trying to assess prior knowledge or understand prior knowledge and kind of where students are at in terms of that, whether that's, whether that's good and solid or there's misconceptions there, then I think that's one of the first barriers to kind of how you address that. But I think blended learning, because of the kind of the Ps of pacing, personalization, can help with that side of things as well. So hopefully that goes some way to answering your question, Brian, but I'm sure you'll come back to me online if it's not. Anyone else? That's it. Thank you. Okay, great.
Interested in, you mentioned AI quite a bit, and in what's happening in relation to that, and we're certainly very conscious of it in relation to assessment design and working with ChatGPT in a positive way, but also understanding the threats that it poses to the, I suppose, the experience of learning and teaching as well. So I wonder about, I know you've been doing a lot of research in this space as well, and can you hear me? Oh yeah, sorry. I'll have to repeat that. My question is around AI and the impact it's having in higher education, and your views around the role it will play. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I suppose some practical approaches or some ideas that you've seen in the sector, maybe it's in the UK or internationally, where they're approaching it in a positive way, or perhaps they have seen opportunities for the enhancement of teaching development, looking at student success. If there's any, we are in the midst of, I suppose, a strange area and it's here to stay with all of us in work and in education. So
yeah, I think there's loads of positive kind of opportunities, I think, with AI. I think it's a shame in a way that kind of the threats have sort of slightly dominated the conversation. But I think there's been some really interesting uses actually in teaching and learning that kind of predate all this kind of recent buzz. So one of the ones that I always think of, some of you may be familiar with this, but is Georgia Tech in the US. So they developed a chatbot that supported a really high enrollment online course. And they kind of trained it on the sort of questions and the kind of queries that students got. And actually what the students did is they kind of voted. They didn't know initially that this teaching assistant was kind of basically an AI assistant, because they gave it a human name and they just kind of wanted to test them waters a little bit, which is potentially questionable around transparency. But they kind of eventually found out. And I think they kind of put this AI assistant through as for a kind of teaching award, actually. But I think that was, yeah. So I think that was really interesting, actually. And I was at a talk recently with a chap from IBM, and what he was talking about is they're developing something called a federated kind of AI. And basically what that means is, if you think OpenAI is kind of everything that's out there, the federated is more about, it's your data, it's your knowledge. And so, I mean, it'd be difficult, I guess, in terms of cost, but this idea that you might be able to train, an AI tutor in your particular area that addresses, particular misconceptions that students have or questions that they have to kind of support that. I think that's a really promising direction. I think for teaching, there's lots of different avenues for that. I guess one of the big parts of teaching is communication, right? And how we inspire and how we explain and how we use stories and, those kinds of things to convey what we mean to students, metaphors, analogies. I think there's kind of real potential around using AI to kind of bring life to our words and the way that we kind of communicate things in education as well. So, I think there's a kind of couple of things that come to mind. I always think with AI and digital technology, if you kind of think, if you think you kind of line from beginning of time to now, digital technology is not even going to it's just going to be like a tiny little spot. So we're still figuring a lot of this stuff out. But I think, I guess a challenge for all of us is kind of being in amongst those conversations. And, certainly at times, even though I kind of work in this field, it's kind of difficult to keep up. But I think, those are interesting avenues. I guess people often talk about as well, students kind of critically reflecting on the kind of outputs that AI kind of provide. And I think there's potential in there, but I think you need to have the ability to critically reflect on those things, which is kind of one of the points I was making around knowledge. So if you kind of cut the legs off that kind of knowledge base to be able to interpret, that's a challenge. But students are at different levels and different stages through their courses. So at certain points, I think that would be valuable. But yeah, I think it's a shame that the kind of challenges around integrity have kind of been drowned out, really. But I think those are a few things that kind of come to mind in terms of supporting students and supporting teaching.
Yeah, no, sounds good. We must check out that in Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
One of our work packages, actually, in EdTutor, the EdTutor project, which you'll hear about in a moment, is to pilot a chatbot type solution on a program. So the idea would be, I thought, maybe a teaching assistant or maybe some sort of a help assistant around navigating the assessment and the student experience. So
I don't know how people feel about machines potentially taking teaching awards away as well. That could be a bit of a problem.
Interesting. Now, I wonder if there's any more questions. I have another question, but I think you probably answered it in your comment there. You talked a lot about lifelong learners, and it's something, lifelong learning is something we try to instill in our students and also with colleagues. And again, as we've come out of the pandemic, and it has been challenging to engage staff and students in relation to ongoing continuous professional development and that whole idea of lifelong learning, and also bringing in that we do not forget all the digital learning that took place and all the digital skills that were built up during COVID. And I suppose thinking about that promotion of lifelong learning again and trying to, I feel sometimes we're starting from scratch since we've come out of COVID. And it's like we're trying to instill a lot of these ideas back into the classroom and certainly within our education, the educators in higher ed as well. So any practical ideas or things you've come across or ways of influencing students and staff around the value of lifelong learning?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the first thing to say is, I suppose lifelong learning feels like a little bit of a kind of, it's just, I guess we're all busy and we all have different priorities, don't we? And so the sense of which, well, you need to develop yourself as a lifelong learner, well, that can wait until I've kind of graduated. So I think there's also maybe something around the kind of framing of lifelong learning. We know it's important for the future, but is that a big enough of a motivating factor to say you need to be a lifelong learner and that's going to affect you in the here and now? I don't know, maybe people have different views on that. But the way I think about it is I guess referring back to what I was saying about metacognition is kind of how can we help students with their learning and adopting different strategies and kind of developing their knowledge around those things now. And that doesn't have to be under the banner of lifelong learning, but it's ultimately equipping them to be, good learners. Again, a lot of the kind of research seems to suggest that, learners don't always adopt the best strategies, rereading, kind of highlighting. They're not kind of doing really active things. So I think we can demonstrate those things in our courses through the things that we ask students to do and being transparent about the reasons why we're doing those things. I think there's other universities that have kind of tried to more directly address kind of learning how to learn. So I mentioned Michelle Miller a little bit, who's kind of talks a lot about this in the US. I think what she did in her institution is she did kind of like a primer course on some of these things and kind of some of the kind of key ideas behind learning and strategies behind them. So I think being a lifelong learner is important, but I wouldn't necessarily address lifelong learning explicitly? Kind of in what ways can you develop students' kind of skills and understanding around learning and the sorts of things that would be valuable for them in the here and now, and they'll take them with them kind of into kind of the future. And if we're explicit about those things, often we get students to do things, we don't really explain why we're getting students to do those things. If we're explicit about them, they can think, actually, this strategy I used, I understand why I used it, and they can kind of carry that with them into their life and kind of future study.
Great. Thanks, Neil.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.